So we will get started with Michael Mina and a new approach to testing.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to get an opportunity to talk in this grand rounds. So I'm going to be speaking today about COVID-19 testing strategies and how we can use testing for surveillance and more importantly for control of epidemics that extend beyond how we normally think of COVID-19 as a tool for diagnostic purposes. So I like to start out with this slide here, just to drive home, if anyone continues to think that this virus might be disappearing sometime soon, the future doesn't look so grim if we look to what we have known in the past based on seasonal coronaviruses. The future starts to look a little bit, as we move into the fall and winter, we are very nervous that we're going to see increased cases of this virus. So these are seasonal coronaviruses that I'm showing on the two slides on the right here. And on the left, it's a little bit out of date at this point, but just to show that, of course, we all know cases are continuing to climb for this virus. On the right are what we know of the seasonality of normal coronaviruses that are traditionally circulating in the human population. And what we can see here more than anything else is that there are massive spikes in coronaviruses that usually come around November and December. And so if we don't yet know what exactly this virus is going to hold in store for the winter, we don't fully understand and appreciate all of the underlying biology that goes into driving these dynamics. But I think that one of the major takeaways here is that we need to continue to act now to be prepared for what's going to potentially happen in the fall and, of course, further into the winter. To lay some groundwork for what type of surveillance and outbreak control testing I'm discussing, I just want to point out briefly that there's, of course, two different types of tests. Each of these have multiple branches within them, but there's testing for the virus and then there's testing for antibodies. Testing for the virus is extraordinarily important if you're trying to use it as a modality to contain and control outbreaks and stop transmission chains when you know that outbreaks are occurring. And this is because you have to be able to identify people who are infectious and ask them to stay home, for example, and it serves to stop the spread at that level. Antibody testing is an extraordinarily important tool from a public health perspective, and it is one that has been traditionally used for monitoring outbreaks and pandemics and epidemics and things along those lines. But because the antibodies usually develop a week or two after somebody has started to present symptoms, generally they are not going to be useful as tests to stop transmission chains at their source, but they can be used as very powerful tools once population prevalence is low for what I call peacetime surveillance, to keep an eye on a community, large communities, to be able to know where outbreaks are emerging, and then you can jump in with virus testing and other non-pharmaceutical interventions or pharmaceutical interventions to try to mitigate the spread. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be talking about virus testing, and despite talking about sort of these rapid tests that I'll discuss at one point, I just don't want people to confuse them with the rapid antibody tests that were being built back in April and March, but some of them turned out to not be such high quality. So if we think about test characteristics, we usually think about test sensitivity has been sort of first and foremost in a lot of the discussions surrounding testing for COVID. Of course, specificity is also part of this framework as well. I'm not going to talk too much about specificity. Certainly, if there are questions, I can discuss those. But then cost, which I essentially liken cost to frequency of being able to perform the test, and then speed to get the results back. How long does it actually take? What's the turnaround time from the time somebody actually gets the swab stuck into their nose to the time they get the results? Our priority has definitely been, in this country anyway, sensitivity first and foremost, and then cost, and as we all know, speed has been abysmal lately, with some people waiting numerous weeks to get a result. And as far as I'm concerned, from a public health perspective, if you're waiting more than a few days, that result may as well just be thrown away. in a lot of regards. So a fast test that might give results in minutes and that is very, very sensitive is likely going to be expensive. And we're seeing this with tests like the Abbott ID Now and the Quidel and BD Veritor. These are tests that are going to work well. They're going to pass FDA EUA approvals. They're going to be true diagnostic tests, but they're also going to be limited. They require instruments that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. And then they are going to have individual cartridges that are very highly manufactured and are also going to increase the price, which is going to necessarily decrease the frequency that they become available to the population. But what about a test that gives very fast results, is inexpensive, could be used truly daily by most people, but is 1,000 times less sensitive at the molecular level? Does it matter? And the question is extraordinarily important because these tests can be available today. And so to answer this question, we have to really look at what happens within the body and in terms of virus growth. So normally what a physician sees when they get a result back for a patient with coronavirus is that they'll see something along the lines of positive or negative. It doesn't come with much more information. And this has been, I think, a real travesty of how we are reporting our results. I've written about it in the past and we'll have new information coming out about it in the future. But essentially, I feel very strongly that we should be giving clinicians from the laboratory CT values, even if imperfect and not, they are still very valuable. The CT value is, of course, inversely proportional to the virus concentration. And what we know about this is that as somebody gets infected, there's usually an incubation period where even the most sensitive of tests available today might still show negative. Once somebody turns positive with what I'm calling here is the high sensitivity test, or we might think of it as the gold standard qPCR test, maybe their viral load is around 10 or 100 viral copies in that swab. But very quickly at that point, the virus is in sort of what we would call deterministic exponential growth. It's growing very rapidly. And within hours, maybe a day or so, the virus will blow through many orders of magnitude as on its sort of steady march, exponential march upward in viral load. And it will pass the thresholds of even a test that is 100 times or 1,000 times less molecularly sensitive than a viral PCR test. And it's at about that time that somebody actually starts to be able to transmit the virus. And so this is really important because the differential between the high sensitivity and what has been called in the media and elsewhere a low sensitivity test is actually a matter of hours and maybe a day, but it's not a particularly long time. At that point, people are transmitting the virus. And what we normally find when we're measuring and finding that a test is low sensitivity is we're actually measuring down here in this yellow period of time when somebody has actually, for the most part, cleared their virus. And there's a lot of viral RNA that's just continuing to stick around inside of the nasopharynx. It could potentially be, we're not quite sure what exactly is leading to this. It could be some very low level replication, potentially of non-viable virus. But either way, we don't believe that it's transmitting. In general, this is even by the CDC's own admission that after about 10 days, it's not worth testing people anymore because they will still oftentimes be positive, but will no longer be transmitting virus and they could probably leave quarantine. And so this is, the dynamics here are very important because what they suggest to us is that most of the loss in sensitivity that we're getting when we evaluate these different tests is really happening at a period of time that from a public health perspective, saying nothing about the diagnostic use, but from a public health perspective, would probably not be very valuable to help with transmission chain mitigation and stopping transmission because people are already done with their transmissible period anyway. So if we take all of this information and we put it into population level mathematical models, which we have done with a number of different frameworks, what I'm showing here are results from an agent-based modeling framework. The two different colored bars are what we would call the PCR test, or the high sensitivity test. And then the darker bars are what might be thought of as a lower sensitivity test. And we've done this with 100 times worse sensitivity, 1,000 times or 10,000 times lower molecular sensitivity. And what we see is by far the most important piece of the testing regimen that we need to get right here is not the exact metrics on the test itself, if your goal is population mitigation of transmission, but it's the frequency that the test is being used. And if we can use a test every day or even every 3 days, the actual requirements of test sensitivity play only a very, very minor role. And what we can see on the right here is that relative to a scenario where you just let the epidemic sort of move through the population with no testing, and you just have people quarantine when they feel symptoms. What we can see here is that if you test with either of these tests daily or every 3 days, you will essentially stop all transmission at the population level over the period of time that the epidemic would progress. As we start to move out to weekly or every 14 days, we start to have a much more difficult time controlling the epidemic through testing strategies. And so what this is really suggesting to us is that sensitivity should really take a backseat to frequency when it comes to testing as a public health tool. We can also look at the turnaround time of these tests. And what we see is that in terms of turnaround time, where I have, again, the frequency of testing are the big groupings, daily, 3-day, weekly, or 14-day. But then the 0, 1, and 2 is how long does it take to get the result back? And that's very important here because a lot of testing, when we did this, we hadn't even had it in our minds that we might have test results getting back to people 7 days later. What we can see is even at 3-day testing, if you're not getting the result back within 48 hours, you're really losing a lot of opportunity to prevent infections at the population level. Certainly once you're at weekly testing, if you're spending 48 hours to get the test results back, then you're barely able to reduce the epidemic. And to put this in context, this is weekly testing of nearly 100% of the population. And this includes all the variation and sort of our ability to detect cases and all of that. But in the US right now, we're not doing anywhere near testing of the population of the US weekly. We're running around 800 or 900,000 tests a day across the US, which doesn't come close to any of these scenarios. So we've been really pushing for a whole different way of thinking about how to produce tests that doesn't require laboratory sort of testing or these very high sensitivity tests, but can we actually get lower sensitivity tests that will give you results back here in this case where we have 0, that would be the equivalent of giving results back in 10 or 15 minutes to somebody, and they could use it, for example, every day as they're brushing their teeth. And so I think to really, to prevent outbreaks across the population, these results suggest to us that it's more than okay to sacrifice molecular sensitivity for high frequency testing, which would ultimately be much, much better to detect infections. And so I think that we should really start prioritizing cost and frequency much more so than sensitivity in terms of the tests that we're deploying. But why don't we have these tests today? Unfortunately, all of our tests, we don't have a public health framework in this country. Public health has been largely ignored for clinical medicine. And in this case, I would say that we have this situation happening where we just don't have the framework, we don't have the regulatory pathways, and frankly, we don't have the language to even consider a test whose primary objective, or which primary objective is one of public health and not individual health. And so because of that, at the FDA, for example, it requires 90% sensitivity, which is really based around, compared to PCR, which is based around this idea of diagnostic medicine. And what I'm showing here on the bottom right are just CT values from the last 8 weeks in Massachusetts. And this is very, very important because what we can see is the CT values from the last 8 weeks these aren't fully across the whole state, but what we see is the vast majority of specimens that were collected had CT values well above 30. So that means the majority of tests that we're actually detecting people as positive are probably well beyond their period of transmissibility and are in the recovery phase of their infection. So, and this is because we're not doing frequent testing. So we're only capturing people, what I have here, in this long tail of PCR positivity, which is past the period of transmissibility. So what we're calling for is really to have frequent daily testing, which would almost guarantee that you detect most people on the first or second day that they are transmitting virus, versus a very sensitive PCR type of test, which is performed infrequently, with the most likely scenario being that you miss people altogether, or at the very least you miss their transmissible period, and then you end up quarantining them erroneously and sending contact tracers down rabbit holes that they don't need to go down, because they're looking during the wrong time period anyway. So I think it's important to point out that there's different sorts of rapid tests. There are the what I consider as the Nespresso machine model of tests, and these are the tests that are essentially could get to the quality and reporting structure that the FDA currently wants for at-home tests. These will be things like that are already available, like the BD Veritor, the Quidel instruments, but they're going to be expensive. They might work extremely well. They might be able to report back to authorities and give negative and positive results on a daily basis, but they're necessarily going to be limited. However, these are what the FDA currently wants. What I want to see is that we get the instant coffee version of these tests, where we have tests that we can produce in the millions that won't be limited by the ability to produce the instruments. They might be a little bit lacking in their molecular sensitivity, but the trade-off is that you'd get to use them every single day. And so this is really where we're looking at in terms of rapid antigen tests today. Unfortunately, what we can see is this hasn't really been picked up at the level of the FDA at this point. Brett Giroir recently said that this would be catastrophic if we release tests that had only 30% the sensitivity of PCR. But again, PCR, the majority of cases that we're finding are past the period of transmissibility, and most likely these rapid daily tests will be much more sensitive than that to detect people when they are transmitting virus. And to put this all in context, what I have down here on the bottom, my best estimate is that currently with our surveillance networks that we have set up, we probably have around a 3% sensitivity to detect cases in the US right now in time to act on those cases. And so currently this is what we're dealing with. And I think that if we can get to 80% sensitivity or 90% to detect transmissible people and ask them to stay home, then that would be a huge gain that would most likely prevent outbreaks. So I can stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was terrific. I'm a little bit unclear on whether these tests exist today or do not.
Yeah, so
the nuts tests.
So these tests can exist today. They do in large part. In fact, we could just take the example of the BD Veritor system. Underlying that system is actually a rapid paper strip antigen test. But in order to improve the sensitivity sufficiently to get it FDA approved, they had to essentially have a reader read it out. There's no chemical modification happening inside of that. It's just purely a reader. And they had to put it into a plastic cartridge. But technically underlying it, it's just a paper strip test. There's the SD biosensor and the Rapigen test. These are both made in Korea. They seem to work very well. I haven't evaluated them myself, but they have been CE marked in Europe, and so these tests can be available. And then there's a few other companies that are starting to make them today as well. And so the short answer is yes. What I would add though is these can essentially, I don't see another solution at the moment. We're not going to get vaccines tomorrow. We aren't going to, clearly the mechanisms that we're using currently to try to control this virus just aren't working in the US. And I do think that this is simple technology. It's lateral flow assays that have been around for a very long time. And this is the kind of thing that we shouldn't be asking, do the companies have them ready to build at this point? We should be saying, how do we get the federal government to just use all of their might and all of their resources to just start making these. And for a fraction of the cost of the most recent stimulus bill that was passed for coronavirus response, we can have every American using one of these every single day for a year.
That's your vision is I wake up in the morning and I test myself, and if I'm positive, I stay home, and if I'm negative, I go out and do my thing.
Yeah, I like to think of these as transmission indicating tests or transmission blocking tests, and they are, you still would act the same way that you'd act otherwise in terms of wearing a mask, social distancing, whatever is your normal routine. The only thing that will change in this case is that if you get a positive signal, you don't go out.
Mm-hmm. Would you envision, I mean, as you say, one of the things that you're doing here is trying to push us to abandon, in some ways, the medical diagnostic paradigm to a more public health paradigm. The medical paradigm would say, all right, we screen with a less sensitive test, and then we do the better test if you're positive. Is that part of this, or you abandon that idea as well?
No, I wouldn't want to say that we abandon any bit of the diagnostic infrastructure that we have. Diagnoses are still crucial. If you're a physician and you have a patient sitting in front of you who has signs and symptoms of coronavirus, absolutely you need the absolute most sensitive specific test that you can get. In this case, this is what I'm trying to suggest is we create a whole new way of thinking about how a test can be used and viewed that doesn't have to do as much with individual health, but this is a test whose primary outcome is population health, which, as far as I'm concerned, if we can reduce population incidence of this virus, then everyone's individual health becomes much better and people become much safer. And so I think that we need to keep the diagnostics in mind, and we need to start really changing the message that this is not a diagnostic test, and it is a whole different way of thinking about what a biological test could be. And maybe we have to think of it almost as a biomask or something along those lines, where they don't need to be perfect. And in many ways, this reminds me a little bit of what happened with masks in March and April, where people, the general theme was, if it's not an N95, don't wear it. We couldn't trust people to not feel a false sense of security. And of course, now we say, if you have anything that looks like a mask at all, wear it. And I want us to get to the same point, to recognize, to just come to grips with the fact that we're not going to diagnostically test our way out of this epidemic. And a new way, this is just it is a test that people are using, but it's really should be thought of more as a way just to block transmission, in the same way that we think that a mask can be served to block transmission, even if imperfect.
And it seems like, I mean, part of the paradigm here is that even though it is less sensitive, it is perfectly sensitive enough for what you care about, which is, are you infectious? First of all, is that right? And second of all, is there a correlation? You didn't talk about the degree of illness or how likely you are to get very sick. Is that also true? If you ping positive on this test, you have a higher level of virus, and not only are you more infectious, but do we know that you're actually more likely to get sick, or are those things in sync as well?
Well, we've recently looked at a lot of data of our CT values from symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals. We haven't seen a big difference between the CT values of the two. So I don't know that I would want to go down that road and suggest that it would be indicative of that. Mm-hmm. What we do know is that most people who get infected with this virus during their viral replication and their growth period of the virus in their body, they generally exceed the limits of detection of these paper antigen strip tests. So I think that they would do a very good job at capturing most people in the first day that they might be transmissible, or even the day before they become transmissible, if using it every single day. And the reason why we don't want to think of it as a diagnostic is, if there is somebody who gets infected with this virus, but manages to essentially control the virus in large part, never gets to a place where they are potentially transmitting it, then it could be that these transmission indicating tests never actually turn positive for that person. So it's not really a diagnostic. But the good thing is that most people who would be transmitting, in particular super spreaders, we'll probably be spewing out a huge number of viruses. And these tests will turn positive. And to put it in perspective, the PCR test detects detects virus down to around 100 viral particles per mil. When we look at the range of which people have virus in them during transmissible periods, it's not 100 and it's not 1,000. It gets to 100 million, 100 billion, or a trillion viral particles. So all of our discussion about sensitivity has all ranged at this 100 level, 10 to 100 viral particles, when the real importance when it comes to epidemics is detecting people probably above 1 million viral particles or more.
Just to get a little more practical, you didn't talk about the mode of collection. Am I spitting on it? And then the mode of reading, am I looking, is it a pregnancy test equivalent? Am I looking for a color change? And then you implied it's very cheap, but are we talking about, a quarter a day, $1 a day, $5 a day? Any sense of that?
Yeah, so the mode could be saliva, and I know that there's different tests that are being developed. Some use saliva and some just use an anterior air swab into saline. So I think of it as kind of the complexity of taking in and out your contact lenses. Maybe you have a little squeezy bottle of saline that you use every day, and you put the swab in there, and then you drop the little paper strip in. Capillary action pulls it up, and just like a pregnancy test, yes, you look for a line to turn a color. My expectation is that these should be around $1 a day. I think that they can be produced for less than $1 a day if the big companies get involved, or if the US government takes it over and starts producing them. And so a lot of people say, well, that's $300 million a day for the United States. That's totally absurd. We can't do that. But when you start talking about what we've spent with coronavirus, $300 million a day for a full year of daily use by every American almost ultimately is just a small fraction of one of the stimulus bills that has been put forth. So I think it's fully doable from a financial perspective.
Has any country in the world embraced this idea and is using it today?
So not yet as in this way. And I think this whole idea of truly daily testing to stop transmission chains and really use testing as a transmission blocking agent. We came out with a study about a few months ago that kind of pushed this, what I showed some of the results from. And that sort of, I think in general, started some of the conversation, or at least started to accelerate the conversation. So since then, and since we've been gaining some more traction in the media and Congress and Senate and things, we have been hearing more and more countries wanting to get involved. And so on any given day, I'm getting calls from prime ministers and princes of countries and things from around the world asking, how do they get the tests and how do they start using this tomorrow? Unfortunately, my response continues to be, well, most of the manufacturers that could be producing them aren't bothering to at this point because there's no clear FDA approval pathway. But SD Biosensor and Rapigen are two Korean companies that are starting to really scale up production. And I believe Senegal might be starting to do it. And we've been talking with a number of different countries about carrying out these types of studies or these types of programs.
But today, when you hear about ball players or visiting the president, that kind of thing, using rapid tests, none of them are these. They're still fast versions of the more sensitive tests. So this would really be a change in paradigm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it seems like you've gotten a lot of I hadn't heard of this idea until a couple of weeks ago. It feels like it's gotten a lot of traction. Are you hopeful or not in terms of uptake, and sort of maybe parse your answer from the rest of the world and then the United States?
I think the rest of the world much of the world has many fewer regulations. They have a greater sense of public health as a goal in mind. And I think that these things could be rolled out in many parts of the world as we speak, and they are starting to be. In the US, I think that I'm hopeful that we will get there. We've gotten a small army of senators and congressmen involved and very interested. The media has certainly been very interested in applying pressure, and the NIH and CDC have both been, at least from heads of those or leaders in both of those organizations I've spoken with have been very, very supportive. And the question is, okay, well, how do we move it? What needs to happen? And it really comes down to the FDA. And unfortunately, the FDA is the regulatory body for these types of tests, but they don't have a remit to evaluate public health tools. So there either needs to be a whole new pathway at the FDA to say, okay, this is a pathway that you're going for a public health claim and not a diagnostic claim, so it won't be health insurance reimbursable, et cetera. Or the FDA needs to say, this is a public health tool, they wash their hands of it, it's off their desk. If that happens, which is not what I'm hoping for, I'm hoping that they want to keep control of authorizing them. But if it does happen that they say this doesn't fall under our purview, then very quickly we need the CDC or the NIH or some other authority to come on board and say, okay, we're going to create some sort of certification program. Because the last thing we want is for the market to become flooded with tests that really don't work and have this program fail. So I'm hopeful that the FDA will decide that it is within their purview to create a pathway to evaluate tools whose primary goal is one of public health instead of individual diagnostics.
Is there any analogy that you can think of in kind of the world of public health where there is a tool like this and we figured out what the regulatory pathway is for that?
To be honest, not really. At least not tools that are regulated. So thermometer testing is, I guess, in the sense of COVID, people are using it as that. It's not a good alternative. Masks are an analogy, I suppose, but in our culture, in our language, the moment it's a test and not sort of a mask kind of thing, it becomes seen as a diagnostic. And I've been trying to rack my brain if there is an example. Maybe rapid HIV tests would be the closest, and I would say that there is a sense in the HIV world that you getting your own, that giving yourself an understanding of your status is really a public health good, and it allows people to make better decisions about their actions, and that's kind of what we're going for here as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for pursuing this line of reasoning. My sense is I don't know how much traction it would have gotten except for the delays. I mean, it feels like if we could get 2-day turnaround on old style, maybe overly sensitive tests, I'm not sure the market for an alternative way of thinking about this would have opened, but it clearly has now. I mean, this current situation is disastrous. And so that creates an opportunity to think about this in a new way. And I really appreciate you helping us to do that.
Well,
so good luck with it.
Yeah.